I'm Allan McKay, and welcome to the tyFLOW beginner tutorial, how to learn tyFLOW fast. This is a quick start guide to understanding how to get up to speed with tyFLOW fast. This will go over everything from how to install tyFLOW to quickly how to get up to speed and creating more complicated fireworks systems of multiple triggers and spawns and everything you need to understand the new tyFLOW system. I'm Allan McKay. I've been working in visual effects for almost 25 years. I've worked for studios like Industrial Light and Magic and many others on movies like Avengers Endgame, Superman, Star Trek, Transformers, Game of Thrones, Call of Duty, Destiny, Halo, and many others. If you like this tutorial, make sure to subscribe to my channel right now because I'll be focusing on releasing lots of beginner, intermediate, and advanced production level tutorials on tyFLOW and other visual effects subjects frequently throughout the week. So stay tuned and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on the latest and greatest tyFLOW tutorials as I put them online for you. In this tyFLOW beginner tutorial, we dig into the fundamentals of tyFLOW and how it works, how to create effects and build a fireworks system from scratch, and get you up to speed quickly with tyFLOW. Finally, if you have any questions or even suggestions as to what you want to see covered next with tyFLOW, leave a comment and let me know. I'll make sure to respond as well as do my best to create tutorials around the subjects that you want to see. So leave a comment and let me know what you want to see next. So let's get started. So at the time of recording this lesson, tyFLOW is currently in beta. That means it's still in development, but it's fully functional and ready to use in production. And you can download it right now at beta.tyflow.com. That may change down the line as it goes into a full commercial product. However, for now, you can download it here. Otherwise, I would suggest going to tyflow.com to download it. So, once you go to this website, you can look through the contents. This is a really good resource for once you get more advanced and you want to know the specifics or the functionality behind a lot of this stuff. So, for instance, you can go in and you can click different things to see the documentation on it as it comes together. For now, don't worry about that and simply go to download, and we can see the information where you can download the latest version as well as the example scene files, which are really good if you want to get up to speed fast and see a lot of the features in action. So to start out, just like anything, we need to accept the initial agreement, and then we just need to choose if we're using V-Ray, whether we're using V-Ray 3 or V-Ray Next. Now, if you're not using the V-Ray renderer, no problem, any of these will work. So for now, I'm going to do the 2017 and 18. And to find tyFLOW, it's literally located in the standard primitives in the Create panel. So already, if we want to create anything in tyFLOW, we just click the button and then we just drop it into the viewport. Okay, so I can click and drag or however I want to drop it in. And there we go, we've created our first tyFLOW system. Now, to actually access tyFLOW and start to work with it, we simply go to the Modify panel. And here we can see all of the different drop downs. These are to change a lot of the different properties. So we don't need to worry about this stuff yet. Later on, as we get into more advanced lessons, we can start to tweak a lot of this. This is most of the time to do with optimizing speeds and adjusting samples. So a lot of the time you won't need to worry about this. It's only when we get into more advanced subjects. Some plugins, some tools, this is very useful and required, but I don't really suggest we need to worry about it just yet. One thing, if you ever want to check what version you're using, go down to About and you can see there. So again, back in the download here, you can see the version that corresponds with it. So that's just important if you want to see if there's a newer version. So in other words, if you want to get the latest one, you just check if this is newer than this one here. The other thing I mentioned is you can download the scene files here as well. So if we want to click that, and I just extracted it, we can see different things in here. Again, some of these will be a bit intimidating because they're set up more as a really cool example of some of the features. So I don't suggest that when you load them up, they're going to make sense right away. However, they might be really useful and fun to just have a look behind the scenes. So for instance, if I wanted to load this one here, I can just double click on the file and the file will load here. So if I were to just click play on this, what's going to happen is you'll see down here that it's playing kind of slow. And the reason for that is that it's doing a pretty complicated simulation. So keep in mind with effects, with any simulation tools, they're fairly computer intensive. But what's happening is it's calculating down here. We'd see the frame and the percentage done, and it's going through fairly quickly and calculating this entire granular sand solver. So I'm just going to let this play through entirely. And now that it's almost done, what will happen is it actually loads it into memory. So once it's played through one time, it's actually going to play through very quickly because it's loaded it all into your memory. So I can just move around and see this really cool granular simulation where everything's breaking apart, which looks really cool. And this is one of many scene files that are accessible. And again, you can go back to the webpage and see if there's any updated versions. There may be additional ones in there too. So just to talk about this for a moment, again, this is a much more complicated setup, so it may be a bit intimidating, but if we were to access this, again, we just select the tyFLOW node, modify panel, and to access tyFLOW, we would hit Open Editor. And here we can see that we have 3 different workflows, and that's because we have 3 different objects. We have these, the blue spheres is one group, we have the torus knot here as a separate one, and this oblong object here as well. So these 3 are separate events or properties that are set up to work together. And so all of them simulate and break apart, interacting with each other. Now, again, it might not make sense right now, but if we click the README, there'll be information about it. Like I said, we're not focused on this right now, but it will be fun to just experiment with the scene files, see what they can do, and then later on, when you're feeling a little bit more ambitious, to open these up and take a look. So I'm just going to close this down. I'm not going to save it. I'm just going back to what we had before. We just created our tyFLOW node, and now if I click this, exactly like before, I can hit Open Editor. Now, unlike the example file, this is a brand new setup. So we don't have anything in here to begin with. So we do have, you'll see the depot, which is all of the different types of operators we can work with. And again, this may change over time because this is still in beta, but this is a chance to look at this and get an idea of all the many different things you can do with tyFLOW. Now, it may be a bit intimidating seeing all of these and wondering what they do. I want to keep this fairly light. I don't want to go through too much. I just want to jump in and get a workflow set up. But in the future, I'll probably explain what all of these operators do, as well as just in general how these are all split up. One thing to keep in mind is they are color-coded for a reason. So in layman's terms, these are the green particles, operators. These represent creating particles. So in other words, birth, birth, burst, birth flow, birth fluid. There's lots of different births, and all of these and all these spawns, they're here to generate things. So whenever you see something green, it means it's creating something. Now we have blue, and then we have more the kind of beige. It's kind of not beige, but we'll go brown, white, and then purple, and then yellow. Yellows are conditions. So in other words, it's going to test the data and spit the particles into a new event. For instance, we have all the different operators or solvers here for doing more complicated things such as crowd simulations or doing dynamics or different things like that, cloth. So there's lots of different stuff that we can do. Initially, all we want to do is do a very basic setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my window over, and I'm just going to drag this out a little bit bigger just so we have a little bit more room to work with. Now, like I said, it may be a bit intimidating in the beginning, but let's just create our initial setup. So the easiest thing I can think of would be to drag this birth into here. Now, what this will do is it will create particles. It is going to generate particles, but they're all being generated at origin. Origin is 0, 0, 0. In other words, we need more information to give it. Because if we say make a bunch of particles, it's going to say where. Okay, so we can see here that it's saying between 0 to 100 frames, it's going to create 200 particles. And we can see that in the properties. So if I click, I can deselect, click again. Okay, so I can click, and we can see different properties we can change. But in general, over 100 frames, so we can set it to emit from frame 10 or whatever we want, this is going to emit 200 particles. Now, we need to assign a position so that way we can say where to create them. So, for instance, I could go into the blue ones here and we should see a position icon. And I'm going to left click, hold, and drag this up here. Now, one thing I'll point out is, and this is important, when you move it up, and I'm still holding my left mouse button, we can see this horizontal line which is green, or we can see it's red. Now, red means it's going to be dropped on top of this operator, and that means it'll remove the old one and replace it with the new operator. So it's important to know that, because otherwise you might clumsily just drag things up and you'll overwrite or replace one operator with another. So for now, make sure that they're always green. So in other words, you're putting it in between these two operators. We're putting it in between where it's green, and that's going to drop it down, okay? Now, for us to assign a position, it's asking for a position icon, because we chose position icon. We also have object or different ones. So if we wanted to emit to a specific object, we could. But in this case, I want to specifically emit to a position icon. So what we'll do now is we'll go to the create panel again, because we're in the modify panel. So we'll go to the create panel, and again, this is tyFLOW. We don't need any more primitives, but if we move to the helpers here and click that, we click the drop down, we'll see we have tyFLOW. Now, if we click tyFLOW, these are additional helpers we can work with. One of these is tyIcon, which is what we're looking for. So if I left click and I drag this out in the viewport, we can see it's created this new helper object. Now, all I need to do is simply click pick and choose that helper object. And we can see we're now creating, and I'll go back to the beginning and hit play. We're creating 200 particles over 100 frames. So in other words, it's distributing them over the surface of this helper. And the reason I say it's emitting over the surface is because if we look at the properties, again, I'm going to click out of here, click position icon, just in case you weren't on it already. We've picked this icon, and the location currently is set to surface. So it's distributing over the entire surface. So let's get this to be a little bit more interesting. Let's actually assign some speed to this as well. And typically with any particle system, we'll want to have birth, so we're generating particles, position, so we assign a position to it, and then speed, so that way they're moving around. So what I'll do is I'm going to go in, and we should see a speed operator. I'm going to drag this, and we want to put it below the position icon. And the reason is that the ordering is important. We want to go birth, position, and then speed. So again, let's make sure that this is in the middle. It's in between the position and display. We don't want it to be red, we want it to be green. And then we've assigned it. Now, let's play through this again. Okay, so right now we have particles randomly moving around in 3D space. And if we look in our speed operator, so again, just make sure we have it selected, we can see the speed. We can see a variation if we wanted to randomize that. But more importantly, we can see random, okay? So the direction, it says random 3D, which means it's randomly assigning a direction. It's going in every direction. And just going back to the beginning, if we wanted to change the direction, we've got all of these different options. So for instance, I'm just playing through this a little bit more. And it's a fairly light setup, so you should be able to just scrub fairly easily with this. Unlike that granular solver scene example you saw before. And with the direction, we could change this to anything we wanted. We could say a long icon arrow, for instance. And when we do that, currently it's not doing anything, and that's because just like the position, for it to follow in a certain direction, it needs an icon added as well. So the good thing is we can just pick and choose the same icon as the position. So we're using the same icon in the position and for the speed, because the helper here, the icon, has an arrow for direction. So already we can see the particles now moving downward, and we can actually select this icon, and I might rotate this let's say 180 degrees. So I'm just rotating it up. Now we can see the particles are moving up because that's the direction that arrow is pointing. So hopefully this makes sense. We do have other options. We could say from icon center, and that way they move out horizontally. We could say from icon axis, which is relatively the same thing. Inherit previous if it was coming from a new event. We've got lots and lots of different things we could do. For now, let's just keep this on the icon arrow, and that way it's going to follow that icon arrow. Now, let's make this a little bit more interesting. Right now, we just have particles shooting up in the air fairly slowly over, roughly 4 seconds or 100 frames. And let's make this a little bit more interesting. Let's make fireworks or something fun. And the good thing is I'm literally going to make this up as I go. So in other words, it's fairly straightforward to do something like this. It's not going to be something I'm going to need to think too much about. It should come pretty intuitively over time. But for now, let's go to birth. And let's just type in 10 particles. So in other words, it's going to create 10 particles over the span of 100 frames. The other thing is, let's just emit to 75 frames. So in other words, it's going to emit 10 particles over 75 frames. And now if we play through, we can see it's randomly assigning the position, and then they're all shooting upward in the air. So let's make this a bit more interesting. Let's go back to speed, and let's just randomize the direction a little bit. I could bring this up, and they're going to randomize more and more, and they'll go all the way to 180 degrees. That means essentially it's like the random 3D before. They're going everywhere. We don't want that. We just want, let's say, 15 or 25. Just something where they're going in a little bit more of a different direction. So now we can see they're not going straight up in the air. They're going a little bit different. Now, let's increase the speed. Let's try 2. So now these particles are moving up in the air quicker. I like that. We'll try 3. It's a little bit quicker. I think that's cool. What if we did something else that was fun? Let's add a little bit of gravity, okay? So initially in the past, you'd use a lot of the space warps, the forces that come with max, that particle flow, and a lot of other things would use. tyFLOW has a lot of this built in already, and you'll notice that as you get more into it, it's fairly optimized for effects artists. So the way that I've worked forever, for the last 20-something years, has always been using multiple turbulences and other things like that. All of this is built into one system, so you can get really powerful results fairly quickly using the setup. For now, I just want to drop in a force, and we'll put this again down the bottom, looking for that green because we're putting it in between these two operators. Drop it down, and we could pick a direction and lots of stuff like that. For now, we don't need to worry about any of that. Let's just give this some gravity. Now, one thing about gravity is that we want it to be negative because we want it to go down, but gravity is a constant force. So just explain, the speed gives it an initial speed value. It's not constant unless we were to tell it to be. It's just going to apply it once. It doesn't accelerate or anything like that. So in other words, you're just kind of throwing a ball in a way. We're just throwing it up in the air. However, force, this will be constant. So in other words, it's literally going to pull it back down. Okay. So I just want to mention that because they're kind of separate in that sense. But all we're doing with gravity, and this is fairly sensitive, so we'll give it negative 0.01. Let's try that. Now these go up in the air, and it's not too bad. Let's try 0.1, and now it's too strong. So they're going up in the air and they're falling back down. But this is kind of cool. It means we've got particles which come up and then fall back. Let's try averaging the center. We'll go negative 0.05. So now they're going up in the air, and then they're beginning to fall. Okay? So let's do this. As these particles come up in the air, let's make them randomly burst like fireworks. So to do that, what I would want to do is each and every single one of these, imagine they go up in the air and they all have a timer. They tick down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then they burst into more particles. The way that I think of effects is I always break it down very literally. So even the most complicated things like Transformers and other movies I've worked on, I might decide, okay, I want to have a Transformer explode. I would initially create the explosion, and then the explosion might create fire on the transformer and, create glass as he smashes through a car or whatever it might be. So I'll usually break down the steps, and in this case, I want to have these tick down to a certain value. The next step would be to create new particles. So the easiest way to do this would be to go in and test a condition. So what I want to do is I want to go to the time test, and let's just drag this again to the very bottom. Typically anything that's yellow we want to keep at the bottom because they're conditions. So in other words, we want to make sure it calculated birth position, speed, gravity, and then it goes to this. Just good rule of thumb in general. So time test, we'll notice, has a little circle here. And if we left click drag, it actually creates a line. The reason for this is it allows us to say, okay, particles, come down here, then check what time is it. And let's just say that the time was 10. Then it's going to say, okay, on that particle, let's send you to a new place. Okay, so for example, I'm going to now get a display. Display I'm choosing because it's just a random operator that doesn't do anything. In other words, it's not going to change anything. It's purely just going to allow us to see a different color or whatever. You can see we have a display here and it's pink. So if I wanted to make this green, I could click on that color, left click, and then we can make the color green. And when I hit OK, these particles are now in fact green. Other things I can do in display is change them to large dots, and now they're displaying as large green dots. So same thing here, we could change these to, let's say, red. And right now it's not going to do anything because nothing's in here. However, if we were to, I'm going to go to a later frame here. We left click, drag, and now we can see the particles are turning red. We'll also see that they're moving up in the air because there's no gravity applied. Okay, so in other words, when particles land in this operator, or sorry, this event, the previous properties are no longer being applied because now they're here. So it's cool because we can actually see by what color it is where they would be. So if we're ever wondering, like, why is gravity not applying to my particles, I can look, they're red, and clearly there's no gravity in here. So if I want to apply gravity, I can right-click, copy, right-click, paste, and it's up to me. If I want, I can choose paste instanced, and that means it's going to make it italic. So you can see here that they're different kind of font, they're italics, and that means just like in anything in Max that they're now instanced. So when I click one, it's clicking the other, so they have a relationship. It means if I were to increase this to -0.06, those particles are being affected in both, okay, because the gravity here is now changed as well. So hopefully that's not too obvious. I don't want to waste your time, but I do want to point these things out. So let's keep this at 0.05 as we had before. Now, what's happening is over time, the particles now turn red. If I go back to display, let's also change these to large dots as well. And let's make the age test a little bit longer. Let's make it 15 or 20. So what happens is these particles come up in the air, and then, even let's say 27, we want to make them about 27 frames is when they switch to the new event. So this new event, we can do a lot of things with this. And what I want to do is I want to use this to generate new particles. Remember, we're going to test the age, like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, burst. And that's when we're going to create new particles. So to create new particles, we go back to green, because remember, green means create particles, right? So I'm going to hold down the spawn, drag again, make it green. Let's just put it at the bottom. And with this, we can say on entry, because in other words, when these particles hit 27 roughly, and they go into here, it's then instantly going to create on entry. In other words, when they come in, a new set of particles. So these new set of particles, we could give them 10 particles. We can't see them right now because just like before, remember, we had particles being spawned, but they didn't have any speed, so they didn't move around. Same thing here. We need to apply a speed. So going back in, I'm going to get speed, I'm going to drop that down, and hopefully you get this. Like, we're layering things up, we're adding these different properties, and we're giving it a bit of character. So right now, they get the 27 frames, they're going to spawn 10 particles, and these particles are random. So already, we have these particles coming up in the air, and they're bursting out like so. And they have gravity applied, so they're falling back down. Now, let's make this a little bit more interesting. And what we'll do is we'll create another event. And let's say this new event, we wanted to create trails, because we really liked the fact that we've got them bursting, but fireworks have trails, right? So let's create another spawn. We'll drag it down to the bottom. And you'll notice with the spawns, they also have a circle on the right side, meaning that we could send particles to another event. So in this case, I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to drag that display and drop it in a new event. So by holding down Shift and left-click drag, it's created a new event. And these ones here, we could make, let's say, we'll make these more yellow. So again, I just clicked that little icon and we'll make these yellow. Okay, now, of course, I'm not doing anything because we need to plug this in. The other thing that I want to do is going back here, we could do it on entry, or we could do a lot of different things. I'm going to do this based on travel distance. Now, travel distance means that wherever they move, they'll drop a particle. So if you imagine, let's say footprints or something, or let's say a snail. If you were to put a little particle system on a snail, wherever it moves, it'll leave a trail, right? So it's the same kind of thing. This particle comes up, they're green, which means they're in this event. They go up in the air. When they hit the time test, 27, they go in here. And then as they move, because they've speed applied, they're going to create these trails, but these trails are going to sit in here. So now we get this. Now we get these particle trails emitting out, which is kind of cool, because the particle is at the tip and is generating these trails. So let's click on the display, and with these ones, to make it a little bit easier to see, let's change this to small dots, and let's just zoom in a little. So we can see that we have that big red particle, and it's creating a trail of particles behind it. So a couple of things I want to do here. Let's rename these, okay, to make a bit more sense. I'm going to right click, choose rename, and let's say create fireworks. And then right-click, rename burst fireworks. And then we'll rename this to fireworks trails. So one thing is that these particles, they look cool, but they're kind of moving, if you look ahead, they're moving faster than the red particle is. So we might want to tell these to actually move slower. So if we go back to spawn, we have travel distance, that's great, but we see velocity. So these particles already have velocity being created. Now, the reason it has velocity might be that if you imagine you have an animated Pixar character, he jumps in the water, swims around, let's say it's an animated dog, and he comes out of the water and he shakes all his fur. What you want is the fur to like fling particles in every direction. And that's kind of what we're doing here. We're giving them some additional velocity. The thing about trails is that we just want things that are kind of breaking away from everything. So what we can do is lower that inheritance value, and we can see in real time that they're starting to go behind. So the lower the velocity, the more they just trail behind. So this can be really useful in general because it means that now we're getting these particles shooting out like so, and this looks a lot more like fireworks. So there's a couple of things we can do here. One thing that I would like to do is these fall down as if they've got a lot of weight to them. So in other words, with the red particles, which are obviously the head of it all, I want them when they burst out to, rather than being a propelled like rocket shooting up in the air, I want these ones to kind of explode out and kind of fizzle away over time. So what we can do is make them slow down, right? So again, this is perfectly named. We can just go and drag the slow, and it's got a little snail icon there. We can drag that and put that above the spawn. Again, any tests, I said all the yellow ones, but technically the spawn has an output. So in other words, anything doing an output, we probably want to have at the bottom unless there's a reason for it. So the speed we put there, and this means that it has gravity, but it's also going to slow those particles down. So now they're bursting out, but they don't have as much force to them anymore. The other thing that we could do is we could tell these particles to actually die over time. We could say, fizzle out. So the red particles fizzle out over time. So to do that, we would go back and let's just drop in a delete operator, and we'll put that at the bottom, only because it doesn't really matter. It's just testing the time. We can put it wherever we want, but the main thing is it's going to say on entry, delete the particles. We don't want that. We want to say event age, because it doesn't matter when they come in here. We want to do it based on when they came in here. So as soon as these particles turn red, this timer begins. And so we could say the range, like it's going to say it's going to continue to delete until they're dead over 1,000 frames. We don't need that. We could just say over 20 frames. Let's try that. So all it means is that this operator doesn't do anything until these particles are red for 20 frames. So it comes up 27 frames in, roughly, they're going to burst out, and after 20 frames, the red particle begins to die. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We've just set this up where the red particle dies, and then we just have these particles doing their thing. They just sit around. Now, what would be really cool is if we did a couple of things. One would be, let's make these particles slow down as well, or not have much speed as well. So I'm going to get that slow. I'm going to hold shift and drop it, again, green at the top. That should make them settle down a little bit. And we could also then go and add, like, let's hold shift, force, drag it in to copy it. Now with this gravity, I'm going to set it to be a lot lower. Okay, so I'm going to make it 0.01, negative 0.01, and it also has that drag. So in other words, they're just going to blow down a little bit. However, what we could do, just for fun, is we could actually, it's got wind in here, we got X, Y, Z, so X positive means it's going to go to screen right, so we could just give this a little bit of drift. We might need to test to see which direction it's blowing in. Okay, so it looks like we want to make this negative 0.01, in this case, Y. And that way they got a little bit of wind applied. So we make it's even negative 0.03. So it's just got a little tiny bit of wind drift to it. Okay, so that might just be something fun to play around with. Now the reason that it's negative value on Y, in other words, if we want to figure out like how does this work, I don't want to get too technical, but we can click our tyFLOW icon and we go up to move. We can then see here that Y positive is actually going this direction, which means Y negative is this direction. Okay, so in other words, that's how we could figure out, like, X, Y, and Z is because X positive, X negative, Y positive, Y negative, Z positive is up, Z negative is down, which is the gravity. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now we got these particles shooting out. They're pretty simple, but it gives us something to start with. And what if we wanted to create finer trails? In other words, more yellow particles, because there's kind of gaps in between them. We could do that. We could go back to the spawn, because that's where we're generating them, and we could change this value. Now, I want to point out that this value is very sensitive. The lower it is, the smaller the gap in between the particles. In other words, I put 0.2. They're very fine now, because the gap is closed. It's a lot slower. We're a lot smaller. So if we were to set this to 2 or 5, we can see less. 1 is the default. So I want to point this out because it's very easy to accidentally put the value too low, and then the particles are going to try and create a lot of particles. Same thing if you don't have this linked to output the particles, it'll incrementally create more and more particles in the same event. So this is important to be aware of, because it's very easy to overload your system by making it create too many things at once. So in other words, all that's going to happen is your computer might freeze while it's trying, or 3ds Max, I should say, not your computer, might freeze while it's trying to calculate this, which is why you want to be careful. Don't use the spinner. Try to type the values in, because that way you can incrementally go down as much as you need to. Like, I think 0.1 is too much. 0.2 perhaps, because we're going to be zoomed out a little bit. So now we have these particles shooting out like so. Okay, so a couple other things I want to do just to make this a bit more interesting. Let's say that we like these trails. We want to create more when these green particles are coming up in the air. We could do that. We could hold down Shift, or okay, in tyFLOW you can hold down Shift, but here I'm just going to right-click copy, right-click paste, and we've pasted this event. Again, make sure that that is a paste, not a paste instance, just regular paste. And what we can do here is I could, again, just get the spawn, drag it to the bottom, and this one I can link. Sorry, here we go. I can link these particles to spawn into this new event. Now, just like before, we want to do travel distance, and suddenly we've got these particles shooting up in the air. Again, we can lower the inheritance. Now, let's not make this as strong as it was. Let's try 75. Let's also try varying the particles a little bit. So the whole idea is that this way they're a bit more randomized. Try bringing that down. Let's say 50. And we can set the divergence. And that means the way it spreads. Like if we look at our speed, we have that divergence here. So same thing with the spawn trails. We can make these kind of spread out over time. So we set that to 10. So all that happens is now we have these trails coming out, and let's add more particles. So again, step size, 0.3, and now we have trails coming out as well. Let's make that divergence a little bit tighter. Let's say 5. So now we have the trails coming out in the air, and the whole thing is exploding and settling down. Okay, so that's a good starting point. Going back to the green, I'm going to make left click on the yellow here. I'm going to make this green as well. I'd rather these kind of stay similar color. Let's actually make these a little bit darker green. And we can make these ones, left click on the yellow. Let's actually make that more orange. So we've done a lot already, but let's make this a little bit more interesting. A couple of things that I can do. One would be with the spawn on the firework trails. Let's increase the inheritance on this as well. We'll go like 55, but we can vary that 35, or maybe a little bit more. Divergence, we could give that 5, and already that's looking a little bit more interesting. Now, let's do a couple more things. One is we could emit more particles. So if we go back into here, we have 10 particles. They go up in the air. And then here we have that spawn. That spawn here is going to burst out particles. We have 10. Let's do like 35. And let's vary that by 35 or 50 or 10. You know, whatever we wanted to do, whatever looks good, you know, feel free to explore. So already we've got these bursts. And as they burst, the particles are going down the ground. The thing is, everything is very static. It just kind of like drops down diagonally because it's got a bit of wind, a bit of gravity. So finally, let's introduce a bit of randomness into this. So as these particles are going up in the air, we could introduce, and remember these two are linked, but we can introduce a little bit of turbulence. Now turbulence will allow things to move, like if you picture cigarette smoke, the eddies, the way that it kind of moves around, that's exactly what we could do here. We could add in a little bit of strength. Let's change this to turbulence. There are different algorithms, or I should say, yeah, essentially algorithms. There are different formulas for doing turbulence, but we'll just increase the frequency. I usually just keep it, like it doesn't matter, it's more to do with what visually works, but I usually bring it up a little bit, but then I bring the scale down. And so, you know, let's just say 0.3. And already the directions are kind of veering away, so they kind of spiral away over time. And it also, as they begin to fall, the paths of the red particles is kind of different over time too. So in general, that's just making this a bit more interesting to work with. Now, with the yellow, we could do the same thing. We could go in and we could give this a little bit of turbulence. Let's click Turb, I'm just going to throw in some values. It doesn't really matter. I'm just doing what works. But already I think that this kind of works. 0.05 maybe, not as strong. Yeah, this is a little bit too much, but we can see that it's working. So let's try to set the scale 0.15 or something more high frequency. But then the strength we'll set to 0.01. In other words, we're not getting much turbulence going on. So it's just something to play with and see what we like. I do feel like the gravity here is a bit too much. What I can do is these two are linked. What if the red particles, I didn't like the fact that they zigzagged everywhere? I can actually right click and choose make unique, and that means it'll break the connection between these two. So if I click that, now they're not in italics. Now if I select one, it doesn't select the other. So in other words, now I could bring the scale up, I can lower the amount, and now the direction is a bit more linear, because I think that kind of works for what we're doing. Okay? So that's the general, kind of setup that we want to do. A couple more things, going back to spawn. Let's just make them inherit a little bit more velocity, so we could increase that just a little bit. Bring the diversions down a little bit, because it has turbulence too, so we're just playing with the yellow particles the way they're spawned. Same thing with the turbulence. We could lower the wind a little bit and lower the turbulence even more. And I think in general we've got something that works pretty well. Okay. Finally, with the gravity here, I'm going to get rid of the wind altogether. So this is for the initial firework trails. So I'm changing a few things quickly, but if you miss something, like, it doesn't matter too much. I'm just fiddling around a little bit to see what we get from it. Same thing, finally, I'm just going to go back here one more time. I feel like these particles just have a bit too much gravity. They come down a little bit too much. So let's get rid of the gravity. And same thing with these guys. I'm going to go back. Let's lower the gravity. And you can see how much that changes things. So negative 0.03. So now we have these things bursting. It looks kind of cool. Very simple setup, but the cool thing is that we now have all of this happening. So finally, what if we wanted to randomly delete these over time? I could get another delete operator, drop it in, and then we could say event age. And we could set this to be, let's say, over 20 frames. That's when it'll start. Okay, so it'll start to delete these particles. So they'll start to die out pretty soon. But what if we then randomize that very drastically? This means that some will die sooner, some will die later. It just means over time, we can see that they begin to die. Now, I could make that more obvious by setting it to 50 frame variation, but it just means that these particles are dying over time. Okay? So, last thing that I want to do, I'm going to go back to my spawn trail here, and let's just set the velocity to be very low. Let's try 10. And this way they're trailing up in the air. It's a little bit too much. They look like palm trees. So let's try a little bit higher. So let's do the same thing. Let's hold shift, drag onto the green, the particles here, but let's set the variation to 20 and this to 10 or 15. The whole point is that now these particles will begin to die over time as well. So already now we're getting these particles all bursting, all randomly, and they're creating trails that begin to die out over time. So this happened pretty quickly. We started with a birth operator. We picked this icon to distribute the position. We assigned the speed to follow that same position icon. We then simply gave it some gravity with a little bit of turbulence. And then we just told them to spawn trails. So I'm going to left click on the right side of this. That just turns it off. And the reason I'm turning that off for a second is so we can just look at everything else. So by turning the popping off, now these particles never expire. They never tick down to 27 and then go into this event because it's turned off. Okay, so if it's on, they explode. If it's off, they don't. So right now, these particles just emit trails. That's all they're doing. But by turning it on, now these particles, after 27 frames, they go into the burst event, and this burst event, it creates new particles. It's going to create 35 roughly particles, and we could randomize that as well. And then they're going to have gravity, a little bit of turbulence. They're going to have speed initially to throw those particles around randomly, and they're going to slow down over time, so they have a little bit of drag to them. And more importantly, they're going to delete randomly after 20 frames, or sorry, at 20 frames they're going to delete, I should say. So we could randomize that a little bit if we wanted to. But the key thing is that these red particles, again, if I turned that off, they would just burst out like that. So again, by adding all these events, we're creating all these properties. And this one here, again, is just creating spawn trails, and we've randomized everything. So we're getting something really cool. And it's very easy to set this up. Now, finally, if I go back to birth, I could set this to be over 100 frames, 20 particles. That's going to be a lot of particles. So we're going to get a lot of popping going on. What we could do is go back to this position. We could go back to the modify panel, and I could change the width to be a lot longer. Okay, I went a little bit too far there, but let's just say that long. So what's going to happen now is these particles are going to be bursting out all over the place. Now, let's say that I want them to, a few of them to get up here. I could just go back to the time test, and I could randomize that, so that way some start sooner, some start later. We can increase it then. So the whole point is that we've got particles shooting up in the air, and then they're beginning to burst. I'm going to right click on my play button here. I'm just going to set this to 150 frames. I think that might be better, just so it's a little bit longer. But there we go. Now we've got all this bursting. So one thing we can do is let's increase the amount of particles being spawned. I'm going to say like 75, and that might help a little bit. But already we've got a pretty cool system where we've just got all these things bursting out like so. All just by using a couple of simple properties, right? So hopefully this makes sense. Again, it's a pretty straightforward thing to do, but I'm hoping that this is a good workflow to get you up and running fast. So I want to take this a little bit further now. Let's randomize the colors. This will be the last thing that we do, but this way we can render it out. What we can do is, let's say that we want to assign random colors when these are created. I can simply just go to the shape operator. These all here are shapes and fragments, different things like that. I'm going to drag shape to the top. Let's also go to display, and let's change this to geometry. And that way, instead of seeing those red dots, we're going to see actual shapes being created. Okay, so with this, we can choose, when we click geometry, we can choose a lot of different things. I want to choose 3D, and for now, let's just choose cubes. We can change this later on. The reason is I just want to keep the geometry simple, but I also want to keep it 3D. Or instead of cubes, we could say spheres, but low-res spheres. Okay, so we can see they're quite low-res. If you have a slow computer, use cubes. If you're using cubes, we can also add the rotate. So I'm going to drag that in. It won't matter on a sphere because the sphere's orientation won't really matter. But key thing is that now we have these spheres being created instead. Now, technically, anything created here, it'll inherit that shape down here. So if we go to display, we can change this to geometry. And we can see that the geometry inherited into the new event. So we could do that, however, we do want to change the scale. So I can go scale, drag that in to change the scale properties. Hopefully this is making sense. Whenever I want to change something, there's typically in the blue here, there's a property that will do that. If I wanted to slow things down, there's a slow down operator. If I wanted to rotate something, there's a rotate operator. If I want to give it speed, there's speed. So again, all of these different things are very well thought out. So with this, I could inherit previous scale, okay? But then I can set it to 50, 25. Looking in the viewport, what works? What could be really cool instead is to have this at like 75, but then we could have it actually scale down over time. There's lots of different stuff we could do. So without getting too technical, one thing we could do is I'm going to drag another scale. In fact, I'm going to put a scale into here. We'll turn that off for a second. And, sorry, with this one, so we'll inherit the previous, but we'll set it to like 95, so it's a little bit smaller. So they're a tiny bit smaller than the original particles. But then we can turn on the second one, and we can change this to scale by multiply. We'll try that. So what's going to happen is over time, these are going to scale down. So I think this is interesting because what happens is we get these particles burst out. They're very defined. They're quite large, but they quickly begin to scale down. And we could, of course, randomize that. Let's say 9710. So what happens is we get these particles that burst out and they quickly begin to scale down over time. There's different things, and I really urge you to experiment and to see what you can find. Relative add, for instance, will add over time. We could turn the scale variation off, but this way, you know, it might be a little bit more subtle. But this is a way that we can get particles to scale over time and disappear, much like real particles. Real fireworks. They'll lose their light, which essentially is what we're kind of making it feel like here. They'll lose their mass. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, but now this looks a bit more interesting. We've got these particles. We initially set up the size here. In other words, we shrink them a little bit, but then we make them shrink continuously. They add each frame, they're additive. So this is why the ordering is important, because otherwise this would override it and it wouldn't really matter. Well, inherit would be okay, but with absolute, things like that, they'd fight each other. So again, we're building this up and making it more and more complex, but it's kind of cool as we go along. Finally, the last two things we'll do is we'll finish building out all the shapes, so that way not only do these two events here have shapes, but also these ones as well. Before we go any further though, let's actually assign some colors and randomize them, which I think will be really cool. So to begin, let's load up our material editor, which is located up here. And what I want to do is go get material. And we want to choose a multi-sub object. And the reason is this material type allows you to put multiple materials inside of it. So we want to assign different colors, red, green, blue, whatever we want. To start out, let's set number, just click this button. We'll set it to 2. So this way we have 2 colors we can work with, and then we can add more as we go. So initially, to create our first material, let's click on the empty slot here. And let's just choose a regular material. Standard. And let's just give this a color. So just click on diffuse, and we'll make this red. Because fireworks are a light source, it might also help to set the self-illumination up relatively high, let's say 75. And we'll set the spec relatively high as well. And the reason for this is more just to give it a bit of shimmer as it moves around. So doing so, we'll just move up. And in fact, while we're down here, I'm going to say red. Let's just type that in here. Go up, I'm going to drag this into the next slot as a copy, not an instance. We'll go in and we'll say green. And of course, let's click the color again, and we'll just set this to green. Okay, so now we have these 2 different colors, material ID 1 and material ID 2. So the benefit of this now is that we can select our tyFLOW, click assign, and to get control over where this happens, we can simply go into our material. So let's go down to material ID and drag this in here below the shape. And we just set this to random, and we set the number to 2. Now what's going to happen is it's going to randomly assign in this event, and it'll carry to the next, a different material ID. So it'll either choose 1 or 2, because that's what we randomly told it to go between. If we wanted now, we could go and we could add like 4, let's say. I'm just going to drag and copy this down, drag and copy it down again. Let's make this one blue, and we'll call it blue. And the last one, let's call that purple. So we'll bring up the blue, and we'll bring up the red. That's more pink, so we'll go somewhere in the middle. Okay, and we'll just call this purple. So now we have 4 material IDs, so let's go in here and we choose 4. Now what's going to happen is it's randomly creating different colors: green, red, blue, purple, all these different colors. And we can of course add as many as we like in there. So finally, let's just continue this for a moment. And as these particles come up, we could already set them up to be a different color. So if we wanted to, we could actually go and get this material ID. I'm just going to copy, and I'm going to, in fact, let's just move it up here. I think this will be fine. Let's just make sure it's somewhere at the top. And let's go and assign a shape in addition in here. And this way we can control the look of it as well. So one thing is, let's just change our display from big dots to geometry for everything now, and this way we can see exactly how it might render out. So right now it's complaining that this is why there's crosses, because it doesn't have any geometry assigned. So the easiest thing to do would be probably to just drag this shape to the top. The problem is that we need to define the scale, and the problem is that it inherits the scale down here. So the way we'll counteract this is we'll just bring a scale in here, and we'll set that to 100, and it means that we can set the scale here, and when it comes into the new event it resets. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm just going to go scale, and instead of inheriting we'll say absolute. So all it means is we have our shape, and then we can affect the scale here. We can make it smaller, whatever we want it to be. So that way we have these kind of small streams, and then when it bursts, they're much bigger because it's resetting, it's overriding with the absolute scale of 100%. So by doing this, now we have purple, green, all these different fireworks, and when they explode, they're maintaining the color all the way through. So this is the final result. I might just get our helper here, and I'm just going to go display, hide helpers, and that's mostly just so that way I can see this in full effect. But now we have these random particles bursting out everywhere, and we can control how many we want, what we want, if we want to do different ones. And of course, if we want to render this out, we could go and add glow and different things to it as well. Finally, if we want this to render out, currently this is set up in the viewport, but we need to go and add a mesh operator, and we need to do this for every single one. So I'm just going to add it once, copy, paste instance throughout all of these. And what this will do is at render time, it will convert this into a renderable mesh. We've got different options in here. So if I wanted here, I could just do a render. And we can see what we have. Now, at this point, there's lots more we could do. I've got my render dialog open, so I might just increase the resolution a little bit just so I can see this a bit better. And of course, from here, we can start to play around and make this look a little bit better. So things like making these larger, maybe flatter, more transparent, things like that. I'm going to do this very quickly. I don't really want to go too far into the rendering side of things, but one thing is with the shapes coming out here, perhaps I could overwrite them a little bit, so just shrink them down a little bit. The material editor, I can make these all, just clicking that to make this a bit easier, but I could set this up to be slightly more transparent, and the gloss a bit tighter. So just 25 gloss, and then with the filter here, I'll increase that a little bit. And I'm just going to apply that to the other ones. So again, just 35, 25, and then if I want, I could just copy that, might be easier. So additive doesn't affect the alpha, but it essentially will make things that are transparent on top of each other become brighter. So as I mentioned, 25, 35, 25, 35, and the other thing we can do is we can just select, in fact, we could just probably do it here. We select our node, right click, go Object Properties, and we could set up the G buffer to 1 on our tyFLOW node. And in the rendering effects, we could simply go and add in lens effects and then add glow. In options, we can choose Object ID. Now when we render this, it should add some glow to our particles. And of course from there, it's just a matter of, in fact, we can click interactive, and this way it'll be real time. We can go in and set up how we want to make the glows be applied. There's lots of different things that we can do. So of course we can do a lot more as we go through and set all this up, but I just want to kind of give a general overview of how we can get a completely automated particle system creating all these fireworks, doing all this, and of course we can take it a lot further from here, which what I would suggest is go through some of the other videos on my YouTube channel, which will go through a lot more extensively how to take these to render, how to take these to final production. But I hope you found this valuable. I hope you got a lot from it, and I'll be definitely putting out more tutorials in the future. Okay, so what did you think? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want me to create more lessons on tyFLOW, please leave a comment and let me know. Even simply leaving a comment with yes to let me know you want more tyFLOW training. This allows me to gauge where to focus my finite time. So finally, stick around for the next lesson. I'll be creating a much more advanced visual effects shot. We're going to be creating this awesome character dispersion effect, as well as having this character blow away into hundreds of thousands of particles. So stick around for the next video. In the meantime, if you're interested in more hands-on training, I have a new visual effects class on destruction, dynamics, and explosions focused entirely on creating a live-action Hollywood visual effects shot. If you're interested in getting this complete 8-video class, it's free. Simply go to vfxcourse.com to sign up and get instant access to all 8 lessons inside of the class, as well as the scene files, assets, HD professionally shot footage, HDRI maps, and more. So you can get it all now for free. Just go to vfxcourse.com and get the entire free 18-hour class. Thanks for watching, and leave a comment and let me know if you want to see more videos on tyFLOW.